Good afternoon. Hello, everybody. On behalf of EPRS, the European Parliament Research Service, I would like to welcome you warmly to this online event on EU-China relations, future trajectories and trends. This event is the first event EPRS organizes after the Easter break, but reading and hearing the news these days, I think the timing is exactly right. After COVID, the Ukraine war, the cost of living crisis, I think EU-China relations are another topical issue pressing to be discussed. The way policies and relations with China will develop in the future will be of critical importance for our European future. This is because China is not only a huge market, a mighty military actor, but also a geopolitical player of first order and if you allow me to say so, one of the two superpowers in the world. If we like it or not, China is and might remain an essential trading partner also of us and the world. A country which supplies broad range of goods, inter alia raw material and many industrialized goods, of which some of them are rare and important for our development. In view of this, you will not be surprised that EPS is not dealing with China for the first time. In fact, we are dealing with China and EU-China relations in particular on a regular basis via research, publications, and events. One particular publication I would like to draw your attention to in this regard is our EU-China 2030 European Expert Consultation on Future Relations with China study, which was published in December of last year, but is still very much valid. Today, we'll have the opportunity to follow up on the findings of that study and go further, discussing latest developments in EU-China relations, future possible ways how this could develop, and including trends. To this event today, we have invited an eminent group of high-level speakers who will give us their individual views on all of these developments. My colleague Kjeld van Wieringen will lead us through the discussions and will introduce our speakers in a short while. Before that, however, I would like to welcome Mr. Reinhard BÜTIKOFER. Mr. BÜTIKOFER is a leading member of the European Parliament since 2009. He is German, a member of the Green Group, and he will speak to us in his capacity as chair of the European Parliament's Delegation for Relations with the People's Republic of China. We are glad that you, Mr. BÜTIKOFER, have accepted our invitation to deliver the opening remarks and to set the scene for this event today. So with that, without further ado, I will stop here and hand over to you, Mr. BÜTIKOFER. Thank you for being with us today. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hiller, for including me and giving me the chance to be part of this conversation. I also want to thank Kjeld van Wieringen for making sure that China is always in the focus of the work also of the EPRS. I fondly remember the regular China newsletter that you produced as long as it existed. And I'll look forward to many sequels of this exchange because indeed, as Mr. Hiller said, China is going to be front and center. I recall the time when maybe we would discuss China once a month. Then it was once a week, and now it's every hour. Basically, there is no way of getting around the question of how should we deal with China. And obviously, as is the tradition around Europe, we don't all instantaneously sing from the same hymn sheet. Let me start by harking back to the definition that the strategic outlook of March 2019 gave to the relationship between the EU and China when China was identified as a partner, a competitor, and a systemic rival. Obviously, that's contradictory. But that's not contradictory because we're confused in our thinking. It's contradictory because reality is shaped by such contradictions. It's impossible to assume that we could just focus on one of these different dimensions of our relationship. To say that we're just partners would ignore, for instance, that China has been very actively supporting Russia's position in the war of aggression against Ukraine. To say that we're just competitors would ignore that the Chinese are more often than not paying much attention to the rules set by the WTO. I would assume that over the last number of years, and that is borne out also by the fact that there is now a package of mutual sanctions between China and the EU. China has given us reason to understand that the systemic rivalry is more prominent today than it was when that phrase was coined. Now, I think we should all understand that by being systemic rivals, that does not imply you can't work together. You can work with rivals. Every politician, if they want to be successful, has to learn to work with rivals within their own parties. And there's hardly a more intense rivalry than you find within parties, but also with difficult partners, you can try to work together. You can try to shape a mutually agreed upon understanding of the rules of a competition. So insisting on the rivalry, which is hated by the Chinese side, does not exclude a positive and a decided effort to find opportunities for collaboration. It just signals we shouldn't fool ourselves. Just because we want to cooperate, that doesn't mean that we have a cooperation. A lot of people have always been saying China is an indispensable partner for climate change policy. Well, I would say China is indispensable, all right, but not really a partner. If you look at how they behaved at the COP in Sharm el-Sheikh, they were not partnering with us. But of course, we would hope they would in the future, and we should use every opportunity to find out whether that is still going to be possible. I believe that there are a number of issues or problems that will play a major role in our China relations going forward. And I will just identify four. One, and that has been given a lot of attention by the remarks of President Macron. Do we as Europeans have an active interest in playing a role in the Indo-Pacific? Or should we consider any involvement with the Indo-Pacific as a tort that the Americans are doing to us, dragging us into issues, into problems that we have no connection to? I clearly believe that as the Indo-Pacific is becoming the center of international relations, we do have a stake there. We have to understand that without playing a role in the Indo-Pacific, and then we have to discuss what role that could amount to, but without being willing to play a role there, we will not be a geopolitical player at all. So if you talk about Europe as an international force, You cannot shy away from the Indo-Pacific, including from Taiwan. Second, the economic relations. President von der Leyen has coined the phrase de-risking. I like that phrase because other than the phrase decoupling, it does not make us assume that somehow we need to rupture an economic relationship. It rather focuses on making sure that this economic relationship that we're going to continue will not overwhelm us because we allow dependencies that we cannot manage. We have had to learn a very bitter lesson in our Russia relations when we had to understand that you cannot allow yourself to become dependent on an authoritarian dictatorship. That lesson has to be applied to China also, but that does not say let's sever the links. It says let's make sure that these links are not producing unmanageable economic dependencies that would limit our scope of operation. And some of the trade defense instruments that we have come up with over the years since 2016 have indeed attempted to work in that direction. Third, the question is, in dealing with China, will Europe try to go its own way or to partner with others? There are some that are the greatest fans of the term autonomy. I'm not. I believe that the inherent strength of the whole European project has always been collaboration, cooperation, solidarity. And what has made us strong within Europe should also be applied for our international relations. So I am in favor, but that is an issue that we have to discuss, of trying to partner with others, including the United States, but not only the United States, also partners like Japan, Australia, India, and many others. Finally, should human rights play a role? I think it should go without question that they should. That's even in the treaty. So we have to abide by that. But of course, making human rights play a role is not the same as preaching to those that don't want to listen, but it has to be approached in a very practical way. For instance, in the last human rights dialogue, the Chinese side refused to give any information about the health, the place of confinement, and the situation, including the possibility of seeing some relatives of the European Parliament's Sakharov laureate Ilham Tohti. This is a very practical issue where I think instead of just preaching headlines about human rights, we have to be very practical and tell the Chinese side, if you want to have a conversation with us, you cannot refuse giving information in such a case. So let's be practical, and maybe that's not as headline grabbing as it could be, but I think it should be part of our way forward. It should be part of the trajectory that we choose. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. BÜTIKOFER, for your comprehensive and most interesting and inspiring reflections. With that, I hand over now to my colleague Kjeld, who will lead you through the rest of the discussion. Over to you, Kjeld. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Wolfgang. Also to Mr. BÜTIKOFER for his very inspired address. We've we're here right now with almost a very encouraging number of almost 200 participants, also indicating the interest in, that there is for discussions on China. So this is definitely something that I think we should also keep pursuing in the future, as it's only becoming more important, let's say, properly inform our decision makers and to continue this dialogue amongst ourselves. And it's also for this that we've gathered a very interesting expert panel today, composed firstly of Claudia Wessling, who is the Director of Communications and Publications at the Mercator Institute for China Studies. He will talk about and present some insights from MERIC's annual China forecast, which is a very impressive large-scale survey gathering the views on China and EU-China relations from across the world. Then we have Dr. Ingrid de Hooge, who is a senior research fellow and coordinator at the Qingdao China Center, which is part of the Qingdao Institute in The Hague. And she will talk about, among other things, the technological aspects of EU-China relations and the future stakes therein. And then last but not least, we have Dr. Ulrich Jochheim with us, who is a veteran East Asia expert at the European Parliament, fluent in Mandarin Chinese and Japanese, and right now a policy analyst at the External Policies Unit within our very own EPRS. So let's get the discussion started. So I'll first give the floor to Ms. Claudia Wessling to present her China forecast. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Kjeld, for the warm welcome, and thank you also for inviting me to this panel today. It's impressive for me as a communications person to be sitting on a panel with such esteemed and experienced China experts. I myself am also a China expert, but what I'm going to talk about here today is not only my own research. I'm going to introduce you to some of the findings of the MERIC's China forecast, an exercise that we do with the full MERIC's team to look into what's ahead each year that comes in China and in China relations to the world. Little factual information maybe on the forecast, and the link to our recent analysis will be shared in the has been shared in the chat here. We surveyed 880 China experts and China watchers in the general public. This forecast, by the way, I have to mention it in an EU setting, has received funding from the EU's Horizon Europe Research and Innovation Program survey, and the event we did on it were part of the China Horizons project that brings together 9 research institutions and from 7 EU member states. We all aim at strengthening Europe's independent knowledge base on China politics, society and economy, and there will be more MERIC's China forecasts in the future thanks to this funding. So for my input here, I just really picked a few examples from the survey that relate to our discussion here today. I will briefly talk about China's economic situation, then move into how our respondents see EU-China relations developing and where they see particular challenges. And last but not least, I will briefly point you towards what our experts think are policy measures that need to be taken to deal with China as we move forward. And you will see, even though this forecast was done in December, many of the trends that our respondents detected are still valid in the current discussion. And Cecilia, if I may ask you to now share the first slide. I don't know if you're going to just send it in the chat or share it here. I picked this slide because if you want to look at China's relations with the world, you first also have to look at China domestically. And in our forecast, we did ask our respondents, our participants, about what challenges they see for China's economy. And the number one challenge at the time was the zero COVID policy. Now, you all know that in November or end of November, beginning of December, China was hit by a wave of protests countrywide against the quite hard measures that were undertaken in many cities. And our respondents at the time thought, oh yeah, that will be the main challenge. And you know what? Xi Jinping thought the same. So towards the end of the year, he took a really surprising U-turn on his zero COVID policy. You all know it. All the restrictions were basically abandoned. People were allowed to go out and go to work again. A step that not only surprised China watchers, but probably also the citizens in China. And there has always been talk about how this step might have undermined trust also in China's governance, because after telling people for months and years how dangerous COVID is, and then suddenly allowing them to go back to work, that's something that's difficult to swallow for people out there. And we all still witness the COVID crisis hitting China hard. Data are scarce, so it's difficult to know how the COVID wave is really developing in China, but there are signs that the health system is really at a crunch, and people have suffered from high death rates and resulting family grief. What does this have to do with China's economy? Now, this COVID crisis does hamper Xi Jinping's ambition to boost consumption, to bring the Chinese economy back on track. And our respondents in the forecast saw even more challenges for China's economic development. Ranking on the second rank here is geopolitical environment. We have the instabilities in the real estate sector, the financial sector, and government debt, global recession, and also the item of lost access to key foreign technology, a development caused by ongoing tensions with the US and other Western countries that have the high-tech China needs for its innovation drive. And Cecilia, happy if you want to unshare this slide now. The bottom line of this this slide here is there is a lot of pressure and potential for economic stress and social risks in the system in China. Economically, China depends on vital trade and investment relations to foreign partners, but at the same time, political relations with the US and Europe remain tense. In spite of recent charm offensive, and we see a lot of contacts and travel right now, and we'll probably talk about this on the panel later, there are many challenges to China's relations to Western countries. One of the main reasons being, and that was also highlighted in our forecast, China's so-called no-limits partnership with Russia. Participants expected China to stick with a policy of oftentimes called pro-Russian neutrality on Ukraine. And this recent developments, Xi's visit to Moscow, seem to confirm this assumption that our respondents made at the time. So what did respondents think of perspectives for EU-China relations? And Cecilia, if you would like to share the second slide here. We did a comparison here, how this developed from 2020 to 2022. So this is the year that we made the forecast for. Questions were for 2021, questions were asked in 2020, and that's how you move it forward. So in 2021, people were really super pessimistic. 80% expected political relations to worsen in the following year, 22. This had slightly improved in the forecast for 2023, but still we have about 60% of respondents saying, hey, this doesn't look too good, and we do not expect any considerable improvements, rather deterioration of relations. When it comes to the economy, you see that on the right-hand side, people are slightly more optimistic. They expect stability in economic relations and even an improvement of the intensity. This perhaps reflected the hope that a relaxation of COVID rules, which was even expected back then, would eventually revitalize economic exchanges. However, and this is not on the slide, and you're happy to if you unshare it now, our respondents were skeptical on the economic development of economic relations in some fields. I give one example. Conditions for EU citizens working in China were expected to deteriorate by more than 80% of our respondents. And a similar percentage we got for science and technology cooperation, a topic that is widely discussed at the moment. So the bottom line is here again, participants foresee China relations with the EU deteriorating somewhat to different extents. On the third slide that Cécile could share with you now, we have asked our participants, so what are the main challenges for the EU in navigating relations in China? And I mean, the ranking here couldn't be more apt to explain the situation we are in right now. The recent trips of Ursula von der Leyen and Emmanuel Macron have highlighted it, at least in the public discussion or in what was visible on the media, that EU unity on China remains the #1 challenge, followed by both China's position on the war in Ukraine. We saw difficult discussions with von der Leyen, Macron and Xi Jinping about China's role in the conflict. Xi Jinping might call Zelensky at some point, but we don't know what he's going to say, and we're probably going to discuss this in the panel later on. And this third point on pressure from the US to align against China, something that is really controversially discussed in EU circles, as you know better than I do. And also the factor of Taiwan, Reinhard BÜTIKOFER alluded to it. It is an important challenge for EU-China relations going forward. And it doesn't seem to make much sense to just state that this is not our problem. We will probably discuss this later also. And Cecilia, happy for you to unshare this slide. On the last slide that I have for you, I can show you a little bit about what our experts and China watchers thought about how to shape future relations with China. How can the EU help shaping these relations? What policy options lie on the table? And what are policy options our respondents are supportive of? Notably, a vast majority of respondents supports EU policy measures to diversify away from China, strengthen inbound investment screening, increase export controls on key technologies, and place restrictions on China, on science and tech cooperation with China. And there's even some support for outbound investment screening mechanisms. Now, you all know that these are all measures that are that cause controversy among EU member states. Diversification, maybe not so much. It has reached policy circles in all countries, and we recently saw German Chancellor Scholz not only traveling to China, he also visited other countries in the region. So there is a sense that this is important, but many of the other points are still very much contested. So wrapping this up, and happy to, if you unshare the slide now, there's more slides in the presentation in the link we shared, so happy for you to look at this later. To summarize this, when we published the forecast in January, we wrote the following. 2023 looked set to be a challenging year for EU-China's policy. Uncertainty and certain surprises will test the bloc politically and economically. A tough year for Xi Jinping could also become a tough year elsewhere. Well, I think this still holds true, and the pressure to find and implement strategic responses remains high. Lots of challenges ahead. And that said, I thank you all and hand it back to you, Kjeld.
Thank you very much, Claudia, for that very interesting presentation. I would like to make all participants aware that you can ask questions to the speakers as well using the chat function, which you can find in the bottom right of the screen by clicking on the small icon there. Your questions will be answered later after the panel discussion. So now I'll give the floor to Dr. Ingrid Dogen for her talk. Go ahead, Ingrid.
Thank you very much, Kjeld. Good afternoon, everybody, and thanks to the organizers for inviting me to this very interesting panel. My topic for this afternoon is collaboration on science, technology, and innovation with China. It is less in the news than political developments, economic developments, but it is nevertheless a very important and challenging topic, as was also shown in the slides that Claudia just discussed, mentioned as the fourth on the list of challenges for Europe. And why then is it so important? Well, science, technology, and innovation drives our economic and social development. And in collaboration with China, we have to admit that China has become a very powerful player in SDI and is also a very important partner for Europe in SDI. And if we look then at the nexus between science, technology and innovation, SDI, and the industry, we also have to acknowledge that China is a very important, I think by now the second largest economic and trade partner of the EU. So that's why it's important. What is then the challenge? Well, on the one hand, we see that we need this collaboration with China on SDI, but on the other hand, there are many knowledge security issues at stake. And first, I would like to say a bit more about why we need this collaboration with China. The collaboration is actually indispensable for maintaining European SDI competitiveness. China has made big strides in SDI. It has developed strategies and policies. It strongly invests in SDI. It has strengthened the quality and the quantity of scientific research. It's developing very rapidly new technologies, improving its innovation capacity. And China has big ambitions. It wants to be a global SDI leader by 2035. It also seeks to define the global standards for the next generation technologies. By now, it is the second in terms of investment in SDI, investment as percentage of GDP, after the United States, which is still the first. It is the first in publications worldwide. And if you look at financing, at the number of talents, it's also a matter of the sheer size of China. China seems unbeatable in certain areas of SDI. The EU, therefore, in its discussion of a joint roadmap with China for SDI, also seeks to have more, not less, collaboration. More about this roadmap and the difficult negotiations later. Let me first say a few words about the security issues, because there are many, and this includes issues with regard to maintaining academic freedom. In the Netherlands, we use the term knowledge security. Others use foreign interference aspect, for example, European Union. But what is it then in practice? Well, first and foremost, this is about undesirable tech transfer and espionage. And intelligence services in many European countries have highlighted that these risks in the collaboration with China and this collaboration sometimes actually undermines national security. This is partially because China is heavily investing in civil military integration programs, and many research results are used for building China's military capacity. There's also unethical use of joint research results, for example, in monitoring minorities in China. Then the second aspect of this is the violation or undermining of academic freedom and our own academic values. For example, in censoring researchers in China, censoring publications, but also encouraging self-censorship abroad and also harassing sometimes researchers abroad. For example, in many universities across Europe, they all receive now requests from previous PhD students who ask the university remove all the information about their research from the website, from the archives, because it gets them into trouble in China. They may have research examined a sensible topic, or they may have reflected critically about developments in China, and this is no longer allowed. There's also the issue of a lack of level playing field and a lack of reciprocity. There is the impact of recent Chinese legislation, for example, data protection law, which reduces the possibility of sharing joint research data, jointly produced research data. And then last but not least, there's a risk of financial and technological dependencies on China. And this makes institutions, research institutions, universities, but in the end also countries vulnerable for Chinese influence and Chinese pressure. So there are these two sides of the same coin, and we have to find a good balance between them. What is the situation right now? Many countries in Europe feel they need to defend their science, technology, innovation from this foreign interference, and they introduce guidelines. Sometimes they're introduced by the government, sometimes they're developed bottom-up. They ask universities, research institutes to create more awareness among their researchers, to encourage stakeholders to assess the risks and the benefits, to mitigate risks, and in case of doubt about a project, to simply say no to collaboration with China. However, there's still much reluctance also among researchers in the research community, because actually there are not that many incentives for researchers to say no to a very attractive offer from China for financial support for their own research. Other countries, they try to limit collaboration to safe areas of collaboration by either defining or highlighting green areas, the so-called green listing, or sometimes by defining the red areas, the no-go areas. The European Union is also doing this. It is mentioned in EU publications that EU collaboration should focus, for example, on new and renewable and energy efficient technologies, sustainable urbanization, green and sustainable finance, circular economy, that type of areas. But it is complicated because our need for collaboration with China is much broader, and in many areas of research, China is now a major player, maybe sometimes even ahead of European researchers. Furthermore, science develops very rapidly, so what seems a safe area today may be an unsafe area tomorrow, and the other way around. So this is a very complicated strategy. Like I mentioned before, Europe and China are currently negotiating a joint EU-China roadmap on STI cooperation, which aims to establish conditions guiding this future collaboration. It is focused on defining the what, in what areas we should collaborate, and the how then should we collaborate. But these negotiations have been ongoing now for a couple of years, and last time I checked, there was still no result. There's been a meeting of the China-EU Joint Steering Committee on Science and Technology Collaboration in May of last year, but no achievements in that area. A month ago, the Chinese ambassador to the EU, Fu Song, spoke with the new DG for Research and Innovation at the European Commission, Marc Lemaitre. They also discussed the need to make progress on this roadmap, but it seems very complicated. And indeed, when the European Commission sticks to requiring a certain level of openness and reciprocity in this STI relationship, I think concluding a roadmap will be very challenging. In some areas, for example, IPR, China has made steps forwards, but in many other areas, China is reducing the openness, and the academic climate is not becoming better, it is actually becoming far worse. And in most recent development, also I think a good example, China curtailed access to its China National Knowledge Infrastructure database. It's a big database of 90 or 95% of all publications, all academic journals in China, which had been put online and made available to researchers across the globe, often through libraries, but also individual subscriptions. And now they have limited or stopped for the time being access. The expectation is that they will reopen the database, but then with very limited access, because China feels there's too much information online available that may be sensitive in the Chinese view. So then, looking at the future, I think looking at China's ambitions, how it steps up investment to become autonomous in science and technology, the measures it has taken or is still taking to reduce its openness, I'm not very optimistic that we can easily set our conditions for that collaboration. And at the same time, and that also refers to something Mr. BÜTIKOFER addressed in his opening remarks, isolating and shutting out China will not advance our own STI development, and the fact that we have all these issues in collaboration should not say that we should not look for ways to still develop that collaboration with China, because we need it. I think, however, that we should become much more strategic in doing so, like the Chinese are. The Chinese look very strategically at research and science collaboration, and we should also accelerate our own informed decision-making on the what and the how questions. I think simultaneously, Europe can diversify its international collaboration and indeed work more with countries like Australia, Japan, India. Right now, there is a very limited science and technology collaboration with India compared to China, whereas India is also rapidly developing in many technological areas. When looking at the how and what, and in the end, hopefully concluding such a roadmap, it's important to engage with the research community in Europe. I think they have to be on board in deciding on the measures, because these measures should be workable for them. And they should feel they can still collaborate on where it matters for them and where it matters for our own competitiveness in science and technology collaboration. I think in the end, we should invest in Europe, also ourselves, much more in science and technology. I think it's important to stay ahead, as China's advancement in STI maybe slow down a little bit by isolating them, but it cannot be stopped. So I think it is our task to stay ahead by investing more ourselves. And let me stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ingrid, for shedding some light on the complexities of the field of technology cooperation between the EU and China, which is of course becoming an increasingly important and complicated field to maneuver. Nextly, I would like to give the floor to Ulrich Joachim. Please take the floor, Ulrich.
Bedankt, and if I may make a slightly personal remark, because I'm a veteran, actually I must say, I confess that 10 years ago both my Chinese and Japanese were much better than they are currently, which I deeply regret. So you had asked me to first elaborate on China-Russia relations and then on the situation surrounding Taiwan. If I may start then with China-Russia, I think it has become, from the Chinese point of view, a partnership made in paradise, because the major strategic challenge for China is, and I really mean strategic challenge in the terms of military challenge, is what they call the Malacca dilemma. So the Strait of Malacca and the fact that one basic commodity, energy, is primarily imported via the Strait of Malacca. And then the second basic commodity, I will elaborate a little bit later on, is food. And I think just for the public, I think there might be a general interest to understand this, that one of the main focuses of the Belt and Road Initiative has been on Pakistan and a little bit less than on Myanmar. And this is because actually the Chinese believe that they can circumvent partially the Strait of Malacca by building pipelines and infrastructure through Pakistan and Myanmar. We all know that there are a lot of problems involved, but I still think you can see on the Chinese position regarding Myanmar that they still attach a huge importance to this project, or these projects in plural. So yes, Russia is a very welcome partner, because the Strait of Malacca does not hinder exchanges between China and Russia. So as we all know, there is a lot of exports from oil from Russia to China going on. It has probably increased. It's not, looking at the figures, it's not so clear because I think we do not really know the price. So we have to distinguish between volumes and values, but the value has been clearly going up since the Russian aggression against Ukraine. On gas, the truth is, I think before 2019, there was no real gas pipeline available, but then the first one now is working and they are still negotiating about the second one, the Siberia 2 project, which would de facto replace Nord Stream 2 because the annual volume Nord Stream 2 would have been 55 billion cubic meters and the one of Siberia 2 would be 50 billion cubic meters. There are obvious problems if you look at the recent statement of Russia and China following his visit to Moscow. There's a strong pressure on Mongolia. So I assume that there are problems with the construction of that pipeline going through Mongolia. So this might delay the thing because there are different estimates of how long it might take to get that pipeline working. So from that point of view, I also believe that Russia might not only be now the most important provider of the one basic commodity, which is energy, but it might also become sooner or later a major provider of food. Actually, there Ukraine might come in, but I will have a closer look at that in a few days. However, China is definitely concerned. I think people sometimes underestimate the importance of food imports for China. China has more or less 20% of the global population, 8% of arable land, and they rely to a considerable degree on the import of food. And they have rising problems, it seems, with water scarcity and climate shocks. So as they are, as I think Ingrid was also referring to, sometimes the Chinese can be extremely strategic. And I think they're already preparing for a time, they're clearly preparing for a time where they might have rising problems to feed their own population. And in this context, just a side aspect, you will have noticed that President Lula from Brazil is now going to China, and food is going to be, it seems, the main topic on the agenda, because China is strongly dependent on import of soya beans from Brazil. So honestly, I believe that if ever China tries to mediate with Ukraine, I think it might be also due to the fact that they want to access land, make sure that their food imports do not depend on maritime sea lanes, just in case there is a blockade or the first island chain becomes a de facto blockade by the US against China. Then on the more structural aspects of that relationship in the past, as most of you will know, I think there were two or three main obstacles. The one was the question, who was the stronger one in the bilateral relationship? This was particularly acute when there was infighting between Mao and Stalin in the 50s. The second obstacle were Russia's relations with India, which was the second main reason for the breakup in 1959. And the third issue were the unequal treaties. Funnily enough, in a certain way, now Russia is the only country which has kept territories from those unequal treaties. Most other territories which were ceded to by China to third powers, like as we know, England or Japan, clearly now are part of the Chinese jurisdiction, while East Siberia, which was to a considerable degree Chinese, is still part of Russia. But as I said, the Chinese on that one are pretty pragmatic. I dare not to forecast how China and India-Russia relations are going to proceed, because as I said in the past, the fact that Russia was a provider of arms to India did not really please China. So yeah, I do not believe it's a no-limit friendship. I think this is overdone, although it was in the declaration of the 4th of February last year, because I believe that the Chinese actually are sometimes very pragmatic. So if the situation, let's say in Ukraine, takes a turn where Xi Jinping feels that he has to drop Putin, I think in the end he would not refrain from doing so, because I think everybody agrees that domestically after the party congress he's now strong enough. Before the party congress, I had some doubts, but clearly having managed to get his people, all of his people, into the standing committee of the Politburo, he is in a position that he could also drop Putin in. I don't want to say that's a major probability, but in case he felt that dropping Putin would be in Chinese interest, I think he's at least strong enough to do so. If I then may change to Taiwan, and Kjeld had asked me to elaborate a little bit on the timelines regarding Taiwan. There was one interesting piece of news on top of the discussions about the statements by President Macron on Taiwan. And that the vice president, the current vice president of Taiwan, Lai Ching-te, has been made the candidate for the presidential elections for the DPP. And he has the reputation, as the Southern China Morning Post put it, known for his strong positions on Taiwan's independence in the past. So I think this partially explains also now the heating up in the discussions and the situation surrounding Taiwan, because the elections will already take place in January. So we are 9 months before that election. And I have not the slightest doubt that if ever Taiwan were tempted to declare independence, China will react independent of who is present in the US and whether we engage in the Pacific and especially in the Taiwan Strait or not. So there's, I don't want to say there's a major risk, but in the past, I think the US has been very strict in being very clear that they are not in favor of Taiwanese independence, but at the same time, they refuse categorically the use of force. And I think this is a pretty reasonable line to take. Then the second potential date for trouble in the Taiwan Strait, as everybody, I think, all experts agree, is 27, because it would be the end of the third mandate of Xi Jinping as Secretary General, not as President. And he would be 74 then. And unfortunately, now we are in a situation where we have to discuss what the impact of the age of a leader is going to be on a major challenge to global security and prosperity. This is a very, I think, unfortunate development. So as I said, he will be 74 in 27. It seems that he has promised, there are rumors that he has promised inside the Politburo that to reunify with Taiwan would be the major achievement of its term. Evidently, I'm unable to confirm or not to confirm this one, but at least I think it has some credibility. And clearly it would help if at the holding of the next big party congress, he could show that he has attained his target. However, there are some indications showing or implying that he probably envisages a later date. I found a very good article by a very good Japanese journalist from Nikkei, who argued that, and let's be frank, the Japanese normally are better informed about China than we are, if I may be so blunt on that one. Because he has made Wang Yuning the number 4 of the standing committee in the Politburo, the person on China, and he is more kind of, how should I put it, someone who drafts the big documents, the big political documents. And he has clearly been charged to develop a new Taiwan strategy after the failure of the one country, two systems approach, which clearly failed with the, what I call it, the de facto brutal takeover of Hong Kong by the Chinese leadership. So, but this is taken, at least by some Japanese experts, as a sign that the preferred approach by Xi Jinping would be to have this guy develop a reliable and good kind of roadmap for reunification with Taiwan, and probably also kind of ideological slogan, which then the poor Chinese would have to repeat once a week in some ideological session, I suppose. Yeah, but I had pointed out in the past that there are some indications also on the composition of the foreign policy team, which imply that Taiwan will be a focus both of foreign policy and military decisions and planning. There's first the fact that the general who planned, actually, it seems, the Chinese reaction to the visit by Pelosi to Taiwan, General He Weidong, has been made deputy of the Central Military Commission. This clearly taken as because he was successful. You know, China profited de facto, let's be frank, from the visit by Pelosi because they crossed some red lines which had not been crossed before, and they were testing strongly, having a very close look at how, for example, the US and others would react to it. And also the fact is sometimes I feel undervalued that Wang Yi, so is now theoretically the top leader in charge of foreign policy. He was in the past the director of the Taiwan Affairs Office of the State Councils of the government, which is not, it must be underlined, the main decision-making forum on China, because it's in China, in many cases, it's not the government which takes the decisions, but central leading groups. But now Wang Yi is also the Secretary General of the Central Leading Group for Taiwan Affairs. And Wang Yi is also, it should not be forgotten, he speaks much better Japanese than I do, a former ambassador to Japan. So the fact that he has been put in that top position, I think, indicates the strong focus and this huge importance that Xi Jinping attributes to the reunification as they consider it with Taiwan. Then, to make a short story even longer, there are two other potential dates, as everybody knows. It's 35. Again, given that I fear there might be a megalomaniac now in charge of the second most important country in the world. In 35, Xi Jinping would turn 82, which is the age at which Mao Zedong passed away. And this seems to occupy a strong, how would I say, importance in his mind. So some believe that 35 might be a very important date. And as I said, at that time, he might assume that at the age of 82, he might still be able to lead the party. While some then say the last potential date would be 49, the centenary of the foundation of the People's Republic. But by that time, he would be 96 or he would turn 97. And under normal circumstances, you would assume that he might not be in charge any longer in 49. So thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to any questions.
Thank you, Ulrich, for giving us that very long-term perspective, which is very much appropriate for this event, which talks about future trajectories and trends in EU-China relations. We have a few questions. Let's again start with Mr. BÜTIKOFER. So there's two questions, one from me and one from Nadia Balic in the comment section. So my question is, what scenarios can you see for the comprehensive agreement on investment in the coming decade? So do you see a possibility for it to be ratified as it stands? And if so, under what conditions? If not, do you see it being renegotiated? If yes, what elements would need to be renegotiated? If not, again, what would be the probability of the KAI remaining frozen forever, would you think? And then there's another question from Nadia on human rights. She says, you've mentioned that EU did not manage to learn from the human rights related situation of the winner of the Sakharov Prize. What has the EU achieved in this matter, and what would the EU like to achieve in this matter in 2023? You can take the floor. Thank you.
Thank you. As regards CAI, the Comprehensive Agreement on Investment, I would venture to say it's dead as a doornail. The deal was welcomed with only some hesitation when it was finalized at the end of 2020. I recall talking to leading representatives of German business at the time who would say behind closed doors, this is not the deal we need. We will, of course, welcome it, but it doesn't address some of the most pressing issues that we have. And indeed, there are issues raised by the European Chamber of Commerce in China, for instance, every year that are not addressed through, would not be addressed through CAI. Secondly, CAI was concluded negotiating at the moment when the administration of President Biden was still in transition. So there was only very light opposition expressed in one single tweet by Jake Sullivan. I believe that on one front, CAI is even more out of touch today than it was 3 years ago. And it would need serious reconsideration before it could hypothetically be ratified, as President von der Leyen has said. And I would add, it has been significant that the German Federation of Industry, BDI, in its press release commenting on von der Leyen's and Macron's visit to China, repeated the same line, that they also felt that CAI would have to be reconsidered. I would basically rule out any option of renegotiating. I don't think the Chinese would fall for that. They're telling us, this is all to your benefit. We're doing you a favor. Why don't you take it? They certainly would not want to go back to the negotiating table. And if ever people in the European Union, like Charles Michel and some others, would try to push the CAI agenda, I think you could expect that the European decision makers would be confronted by a much more vocal opposition from Washington. At a time when America pushes back very hard against China, concluding such a deal 5 years later, in the face of China's support of Russia's aggression and all that, that would be a terrible mistake with regard to its impact on transatlantic relations without ever helping European businesses all that much. So I think it's a lost hope, a hope that has not developed into a reality and won't in the future either. As regards to the second question, what can we do with Ilham Tohti? Well, I think we will have to discuss very hard how we engage in the human rights dialogue. Frankly, I was a bit critical of the fact that this time around, members of parliament were not included in the human rights dialogue. That has been the case before China refused to do that for a couple of years. And I certainly would assume that if MEPs would have been included, the pressure would have been stronger to not allow the other side to just blatantly ignore the most simple questions. Is the guy still alive? What is his health? Can his family visit him? As is the letter of the Chinese law. Now, EEAS has promised to take some additional steps. I hope they will. But I think we just have to signal to the Chinese side that we're not happy with just having a dialogue for the sake of having it, and that whether it delivers anything beyond meeting will be decisive for our side.
Thank you very much for commenting on the CAI and the human rights dialogue, Mr. BÜTIKOFER. There's a few questions in chat following up that one. And I think, seeing as they're mostly geopolitics related, perhaps it would be good for Ulrich to shed some light on these questions. So firstly two questions, let's say. Firstly from Gustavo Alvarez. Given the tense context in the South China Sea, how EU-Asian relations should be approached in order to avoid conflict and keep on building the best possible relations with China? So what can the EU do in the region, let's say, to avoid conflict in the South China Sea? And if this is not successful, then there's a question from Mr. Prekevicius. What would be the most probable steps if the EU, if China opts for annexing Taiwan, he asks, especially with Russia's war against Ukraine unresolved? So what can we do to avoid conflict, and what would the EU do in case of conflict? Please take the
Look, on Taiwan, my natural reaction would be to say that we would probably, or we should be very clear also with the Chinese side that we would impose severe economic sanctions. I think it would be very painful. It might be more painful than the sanctions on Russia. But I think there are a lot of reasons, like recently, for example, pointed out by Gideon Rahman in the Financial Times, which make that the EU has a genuine interest in making clear to China what the consequences would be. I think actually China has understood the message, because I have always believed that the most single issue they are obsessed about was the freezing of foreign exchange reserves with Russia. So they've seen that, and it seems they are now trying to get rid of their own ones. And they are buying, for example, a lot of gold on the financial markets now, which I find is a bad sign, because it clearly shows that they want to reduce their exposure in case of conflict, probably about Taiwan. I don't see, I'm frank, I don't see us intervening militarily. I think this was part of the discussion President Macron wanted to launch, and I had to look again at what US Secretary of Defense Austin had said in 2021, if I can find it so fast. More or less, he sounded very skeptical on our potential to strategically change the situation there, and said, people might remember in Singapore, I think, that the main focus clearly of EU defense should be on Europe, and that all other things were welcome. But he didn't say it like that. He said it was welcome. So I understood it, welcome but not necessary. He was, I think that he said in 21, and the next year I compared the two scripts. It was a little bit more positive, I think, because in 21 it especially quoted the UK, saying that it didn't make a lot of sense if the UK sent ships into the South China Sea. And then I think probably the UK intervened, and in 22 his comments were a little bit more neutral. On ASEAN, I think this is a very good question. And I think it's linked, if I may also then try to come on the third one, on Indo-Pacific. The truth is, I mean, the only EU member states which has a serious strategic and military interest in Indo-Pacific is France. I'm sorry, they have 1.6 million people, I think, there. They have close to, if I remember correctly, 10,000 soldiers. They have a département, you know, Nouvelle-Calédonie. It's one of the biggest oceanic areas in the world, close to Polynesia. So the French are the only ones. And it's one of the reasons, as you will know, it's pretty funny, we have a pretty strong German-Dutch focus here, but only the Dutch, the Germans, and the French have a national strategy on the Indo-Pacific. And I think, I don't want to preempt what our Dutch friends think, but clearly the focus regarding ASEAN or the centrality of ASEAN inside this Indo-Pacific strategy for the Dutch and the Germans was rightly, I think, more on economic and commercial issues. So this would mean to de-risk, de-risking meaning, I think there the Commission has very fast understood the message to conclude, let's say, or relaunch FTA negotiations with Thailand, Indonesia, and Philippines, because we already have an important, as most of you know, with Vietnam, which seems to be pretty successful because actually companies seem to be investing, European companies, sorry, to be investing strongly in Vietnam. So to launch and relaunch FTA negotiations should facilitate this de-risking from businesses from China, which unfortunately, I mean, the main message, Mr. BÜTIKOFER, I think knows this very well. You get the reaction from business, you get it, but we will have to stay in China anyway. So it's on top for most of them, on top of what they are doing in China, then for additional investments to consider, then to do a kind of de-risking by going to let's say, Vietnam or hopefully soon to Thailand, Indonesia, and the Philippines. The issue, and I think this Charlotte Paul is probably a French citizen. The issue is, I really think that Macron is pretty annoyed about AUKUS. This is one of the main reasons why he made these comments, because the funny thing is that the US at least took it like that, because in the statement made during the press conference of the White House, the speakers said in the second paragraph, the first one ended by saying, we are working together with France on so many different issues. And the French, and then he said, I mean, confirming, I think, my point, and the French are stepping up in the Indo-Pacific, a concerted effort by all to continue to make sure that we are standing up for stability, security, prosperity, and a free and open Indo-Pacific. So I think the fact that they made a direct link between Macron's interview and the Indo-Pacific clearly underlines that also the US administration feels that AUKUS must have been part of Macron's reaction. So whatever you think, the fact remains, I think, that the French have a serious strategic interest in the South Pacific. This is facilitated by the fact that the new Australian government under the foreign minister is much more open to constructive dialogue with the countries in the area. And yeah, so from that point of view, I think there was a very pragmatic European approach. It has been a little bit sidelined by AUKUS, but AUKUS actually, to be frank, as we know, is that AUKUS makes a lot of sense for the defense of Taiwan by 2040, because the main difference between nuclear-driven and diesel-driven engines is that you can more easily detect diesel-driven ones in shallow waters, which are normally waters close to, in between, inter alita, sorry, close to the Chinese mainland and not necessarily only around Indonesian islands. So make a long story short, I think we should do our best to improve by economic commercial investments in ASEAN countries, also to improve the resilience of those countries. So not only do it for business reasons, to not put all your eggs into one basket, but also to increase the resilience of ASEAN as such, both of ASEAN member states and of the organization. Because one of the big, I will stop there, because there's sometimes a certain disdain regarding ASEAN, because compared to the EU, they're not so well structured, not so elaborated procedures. But I think at least they have managed to avoid interstate conflict in the area, which per se I think is already progress. So, and not often recognized by other partners. Thank you.
Thank you, Ulrich. I now have a question of myself as well to Claudia. One of your slides was on the challenges in EU-China relations, and the top challenge that was identified by your forecast was EU unity on China. Many interpreted Macron's visit and von der Leyen's visit to China recently as another indication of lacking unity between the EU and member states when it comes to China policy. And one of your slides was also about the support for diversification from China. So my question would be, in the coming decades, and feel free to speculate, do you think that EU unity on China on issues such as diversification will increase or decrease if you take into account the current trends? Thank you.
Thank you, Kjeld, and that's actually really a question I can only speculate on. Well, when it comes to EU unity, I think there is a lot of common ground also when looking at relations to China. So the Macron-von der Leyen visit has highlighted differences, but then again, we also know that France in many instances shares EU views, for instance, on Taiwan also. I mean, there's no doubt that they would support the statement saying that unilateral action against Taiwan would not be condoned. So it is not all fighting and quarreling. But of course, we have 27 member states. And even if you just look at the economy, there are so many diverging interests. Look at Germany, an industrialized country that has huge stakes in China, that is in many sections dependent on China. Now, dependence is again a term that can be interpreted in different ways. And there's other countries who have different interests. So this is and will continue to be difficult to reconcile. But I think, I mean, the ideological developments or the political developments that are ongoing in China are seen by many member states as something that they would not necessarily like or be supportive of. So there is more reason to discuss and get together and find common ground. The topic of diversification, to be honest, I do not know how this discussion goes in all member states, but diversification when it comes to the economy, it's discussed a lot in Germany, but we also see that this is not easy. Yes, you can get in touch with other partner countries in Asia. You can try to invest, but for instance, business people keep telling us that it's difficult to move a factory from China to, let's say, Indonesia or whatever. It depends on the sector. So diversification is really a complex issue that needs to be tackled from different angles. And that not only holds true for Germany, but for all member states. So to discuss this in an EU environment is probably super important. Also to find joint strategies to get there at some point.
Thank you, Claudia. Then I have a question for Ingrid de Hooge. So you talked a lot about technology and the need, but also the drawbacks of technology cooperation with China. I'm very interested in the issue of green technology, which is becoming more and more important. So how should the EU approach China's ambitions in green technology supply chains? And do you see here synergies or mainly risks? And do you think there should be cooperation here, or should we be competing with China, let's say, when it comes to green technology?
Yeah, thank you, Kjeld. I think there are great opportunities in working with China on green development, green technology, because China itself is investing so much in these technologies and is also in some areas, for example, electric batteries, but also when it comes to upscaling wind energy, far ahead of Europe. So I think we need to collaborate on these areas. At the same time, there are some risks involved, and in this case, it would be in particular becoming dependent on China for our supplies, and that would make us vulnerable again. So this is a balance we have to find, but as China is one of the biggest driver now of greening technology, developing greening technology, we cannot not collaborate. So we have to do it. And I think in general, that's maybe also something I address, we cannot avoid all the risks in this collaboration. So we have to develop a strategic view on this and accept that in some areas there will be risks, and that is fine. And I think as long as you can also be an important partner for China, you can leverage also their influence. So we should stay ahead also in some areas of greening technologies, and then you can have an more equal relationship. And I think that is something we have to work towards. But not collaborating is not an option.
Thank you, Ingrid. Then there's one question from the audience that may be relevant for both Mr. BÜTIKOFER and Ulrich. So let's have both of your takes on this. So the question is, why is China's weakening growth a concern for Europe? So is China's weakening growth a concern for Europe? And if yes, why? And what strategic capabilities does the EU need vis-a-vis China for us to move forward rather than backwards in EU-China relations, let's say? First, I'll give the floor to Mr. BÜTIKOFER. Go ahead.
Well, China's weakening growth is first and foremost a concern for Xi Jinping. In addition, it also has global consequences because China has in the past been an industrial locomotive. And the less the country will be able to continue playing that role, the more the rest of the globe will have to rely on other potential partners. But I think from a long-term point of view, we should probably develop a strategy that makes us less dependent on the level of growth that China is able to produce. On one hand, because the conditions might not be there to revive a lot of growth. And second, as I understand China's economic policies, they are not oriented towards a long-term partnership with external partners. They're much more focused on making others dependent on China than allowing mutual dependencies. So relying on China's growth overly much might even be a strategic weakness. And on the other hand, we know that there are other regions in the world that are going to produce more growth. By 2040, India, Indonesia, and Japan together will play a more important economic role than China. The African continent is going to become a more important economic player. So I think instead of just lamenting about the impact of weaker growth in China, we should strategically invest into fostering additional relationships.
Thank you, Mr. BÜTIKOFER. And then can we have Ulrich's take on weakening Chinese growth and European capabilities vis-a-vis China?
Yeah, look, in principle, I fully agree with Mr. BÜTIKOFER. Just one point, in case China's growth becomes very weak, I think there might be geopolitical problems. I do not fully exclude it. We have this foresight project managed also by Kjeld, which looks at different, in 5 and 10 years time, And I do not fully exclude, as I said, that there will be very weak growth like the 2 lost decades in Japan. I used to work also in Tokyo, so I'm perhaps, as you say in German, a burnt child, but there are very similar symptoms now appearing in the Chinese economy as were appearing in Japan in the early 1990s, which are huge debt, very bad demographics, serious real estate problems, and decreasing returns on, in the Japanese case, it was more construction investment. In the Chinese case, it's also infrastructure investment. So these 4 symptoms are the same, which provoke 2 lost decades, as economists normally call the time between the early 1990s and even them up to the mid-2010s. And there are some signs that this could happen in China. And as I think now everybody knows, growth has been one source of legitimacy for the Chinese Communist Party. So if this source gets lost, everyone can easily, everyone is free to have his imagination, develop different scenarios on how China will react. Actually, there are already some in the literature from closing down like the Japanese did after 1603, or the Chinese did some partially in the 19th century, to becoming aggressive and to cause external conflict to increase the legitimacy, to play the, let's say, the nationalistic card instead of the growth card with the domestic population. On the strategy, I think we have already answered that. If I may perhaps take, if you allow, the one on EU economic security, because it goes a little bit in the same direction. Is that okay, Kjeld? Okay, thank you. Because I had a look recently at what Japan has been doing. They are pretty advanced in economic security legislation, and they are focusing on 4 areas. I unfortunately have forgotten question of being a veteran, the 4th one. So it's supply chain resilience, patents and technological theft. They don't call it theft, but they mean it, and critical infrastructure. So the Commission has already advanced a little bit on that. I think it's also outbound investment. The Commission, as I said, has already tackled partially the supply chain issue. I am not aware of technological theft. I know there are certain things going on in critical infrastructure, and if I understood the speech by von der Leyen correctly, she announced that they would do something on outbound investment screening, which I think, honestly, my personal opinion, would be a very important contribution to the overall package of improving our position towards China in particular. Thank you.
So I think there's still some questions left in the chat, but I'm afraid that time is running out. We are nearing the end of the event in a few minutes. So I'll just take the remaining time to thank all the speakers, the experts, for taking time out of their busy schedules to come join us for this discussion here. I would also like to give special thanks to Mr. Reinhard BÜTIKOFER for your opening remarks and for your engagement in this very interesting discussion. I also hope that we can continue this conversation in future editions of this format, so that we can keep discussing this very important topic. For those who are interested to read on these, let's say, these forward projections by experts on EU-China relations in more depth, you can access the EU-China 2030 expert consultation report, which is which is linked at the top of the comments section as well. And in the meantime, if you're interested, there's also a few more EPRS events coming up this month. On the 25th of April at 1:30, there's an online book talk on women and leadership in the EU by Professor Henriette Müller and Professor Ingeborg Tummel. And then the day after, on the 26th of April at the same time, there's an online roundtable on the 50 years of EU enlargement narrating the experiences of the 3 accession countries, UK, Ireland, and Denmark, that joined 50 years ago. Thank you all for attending and for making this event a success. I'm very happy with that there was such a large turnout, and that all the preparation that we've put into this had a very encouraging result, let's say. So hopefully until future editions, and thank you for coming.